Good evening. Good evening where I am. It may not be evening where you are, but welcome. Welcome to In His Will. I'm so happy that you could join me this evening. As those of you who are here know, this is a brand new channel, and we will be talking about the divine will this evening. And this will be a regular program that will be on. And so we're going to be talking about the divine will and exactly what the divine will means, what the divine will is, how we practice the divine will, and why we practice the divine will, because this is an extremely uh, uh, important and beautiful gift that has been given to us from God through the writings of Louisa Picaretta. And I know that there's some people that don't know anything about the divine will, some people that have heard some things about the divine will, and may have, feel a little confused or uh, misunderstanding of what the divine will is. And then there'll be other people that will, um, really be studying the divine will and really enjoy the divine will. So, um, what we're going to talk about tonight, what I'm going to talk about tonight. I hope that if there are any questions or anybody's curious about anything, something that they've heard, something that they've read, that they'd like to have clarified, I'd be more than happy to talk about that or look into that and see what it is that you need to know, and we can find the answers to those questions together. Um, there are many, many volumes, and again, these are from the writings of Louisa Picaretta. So some of you may not be familiar with that. One of the one of the challenges in a format like this is that some of you will know a lot about the divine will, some of you will know nothing about the divine will, and I actually teach cynicals, private cynicals, um, over the internet on the divine will, and we go through the readings of the divine will, the books of the divine will. There are 36 volumes, and we do go through them and we reread them diligently and we read them carefully, um, so that we can get this message from Jesus. Most of the writings are um, uh, what has been communicated from Jesus to Louisa, but some of the writings are from the Blessed Mother to Louisa, and some of the writings are from God Himself. So we have many, many, many uh, volumes, many writings that have been made available to us about uh, the divine will through Louisa Picaretta. Now, a couple of things that are just very, very, very basic things to know is um, a couple of things. One is about private revelation. And this is one of the things that tends to come up when we're discussing the divine will. And it's about private revelation um, because obviously the many different um, uh, revelations, many different manifestations, visionaries will see and hear from the Blessed Mother. They may hear from Jesus. They may hear from um, other heavenly beings. And so the church is very, very careful about proclaiming these as genuine, uh, or uh, that we should listen to them, follow them. We are not required to believe any private revelation, even if it's been proclaimed genuine and accepted by the church. We're still not required to believe it. What we are required to believe is the dogma of the church, the dogma of the faith, but we're not required to believe in private revelation. Even for well known um, visions and locutions and visitations, such as Fatima, Lourdes, um, we're not required to believe those. And the same is true for the divine will. However, we would be uh, missing so much from God if we were to completely ignore the private revelations, because God has used these private revelations to continue to communicate with us, to teach us, to lead us, to guide us, to support us in so many ways. And so this particular revelation came to us from Luisa Piccarreta. Luisa Piccarreta was a very poor peasant woman in Italy, and she was not extraordinary in any way, like many of the visionaries that we've had. When you think of the children of Fatima, when you think of, because there were children, Bernadette, um, uh, St. Faustina, these people were all very humble, poor, uneducated people. Luisa Piccarreta had a first grade education. St. Faustina had a third grade education. Lucia at Fatima was only 10 years old. Jacinta was only 6 years old. And so these were not educated people at all. Um, Bernadette was at Lourdes was so bad at her studies that she was behind all the other children, and she was 10 years old, which at that time, much like today, 10 years old was old to be having your first communion. And she was 10 and she had not had her first communion yet because she was just not doing well in her studies at all. Um, so this mystical phenomenon that's known as visions and visitations from the Blessed Mother or from Jesus they're rare and they're profound, and they're very, very telling. So we have Luisa Piccarreta, who was in a very small town, Corrado, Italy, and she began receiving these visions and locutions, um, and as she did, um, this went on for quite some time, um, and um, she was receiving them for a while, even as a young woman. Um, she was very, very shy, very quiet. Her parents were peasants; they were farmers. They lived in the town of Corrado, Italy, which, interestingly enough, the town of Corrado, Italy, is not very far from San Giovanni Rotondo, which is just north of where uh, Louisa lived. And we know that there was a rather well known resident at Giovanni Rotondo in St. Padre Pio. And St. Padre Pio was familiar and knew of Louisa. He called her the Angel of Corrado. And so he had heard of and knew about um, her visitations from our Lord and from Our Lady. And but she was very, very shy, very, very quiet, very shy person. And she had received these locutions for quite some time. Um, Actually, when she was about 14, she actually tried to enter a convent, but her parents really opposed this, and they wanted her to stay home. And this was not um, unusual at the time for. It's the same today. It's not. It's not unusual today for parents to be somewhat reluctant to let their children go off, because a life in a convent is not an easy life, and so they wanted her to stay home. She was not a very healthy woman, and so she stayed at home, and uh, she started having sufferings, and she's had a very, very interesting history. So this history that she had of sufferings and uh, being bedridden. At one point, she became completely bedridden. Brought a lot of attention to her in this very small town. And sometimes that was a very, very difficult thing for her to deal with and to tolerate, either with her family or just being known, because again, she was extremely shy. She would run away and hide in the bedroom when people would come to visit, because she didn't want to be around anybody. And in many places in the writings, Jesus would explain to her why he had made her personality the way that it was. And one of the things that he told her at one point was, because she had this extreme shyness, this extreme timidity, and she didn't like to be around, even her relatives would come to visit, and she would go back in the bedroom and she would stay there until everybody left. And he said, I made you this way. I made you for myself. And I made you because I had a special mission for you. And I didn't want to share you with anyone. I wanted you to be timid. I wanted you to be reserved and to be remove yourself from uh, the the regularities, some of the regularities of everyday life. And so one of the things that we begin to learn as we study the writings of Louisa and in the Divine Will is that many of the things that happened to her, and we can absolutely, um, without doubt, um, uh, actually convey this, relate this to our own lives, is that there are things that Jesus has allowed in our lives that at the time we could never understand. But he had a purpose for them. He had a reason for them. He had a very much had a reason for Louisa's particular personality, for her physical ailments, for her, family life, how she grew up. And he was very much told her, these are the reasons that I did this, as he began to reveal himself to her and reveal the teaching of the divine will. So, one of the things that we'll be talking about in this series is um, how Jesus had called out Louisa, and how he had um, fashioned her, formed her, shaped her to be this conveyor of this very important teaching, this very important revelation that he had about living in the divine will. And one of the other things that I found very, very, very uh, uh, interesting was that he, would at a time, uh, she came to a point where she couldn't eat, and she would survive on the Eucharist. And Jesus revealed to her that he was training her to live exclusively on the teaching of the divine will and the Eucharist, which would be her daily bread. So she couldn't keep any food down. She couldn't consume food. It would make her ill. She couldn't eat, and so he wanted to let her know and be an example to others, that to be able to live in the divine will and to set aside our own will to live in his will was really all that we needed. He would supply everything else for us. So um, Louisa had some very, very specific and very serious medical conditions that were quite unusual. And this made her kind of the talk of the town. She lived in this small little Italian coastal city. And so she was kind of the talk of the town. She was known to the priests because she required to have a priest come to her every day, and because she was bedridden and the situation that she was in, the priest would come and actually say mass in her room. And so this was a very exceptional, um, a great exception that they had made, the priests in her town had made, because they could see that she was uh, something very extraordinary was happening. And so they would come in the morning and they would say mass, and she would receive the Eucharist. And she spent her day. She did make lace. she taught other young girls in the village how to do this particular skill. And this is, how she lived. She lived with she had a sister that was unmarried. The sister that was unmarried cared for her all of her life. And because she was bedridden and she had to have a lot of specific care. So there's a lot to learn, of course, about the daily life um, of Louisa. In the morning, she would have around 6 o'clock, a confessor would come um, to her, and she would be in this state of what some people might compare to somewhat of a catatonia. She was not. She was not speaking. In fact, she didn't move. She was. Um, uh, it was really like as if she were dead. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Her body was very rigid, and it wasn't until a priest would come every morning and touch her that she would become unrigid and she would be able to speak and to carry on conversation and move and live in a normal way. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, the confessor would come to her. He would find her all curled up, crouched over. Um, uh, and so in obedience, the whoever had come to her in obedience, um, they would she was like lead. They couldn't move her, and only when her confessor or sometimes a priest um, made a blessing, the sign of the cross over her, um, and on her hand, that she regained her senses and she began to move. This was an extraordinary phenomenon that nobody had ever seen. And so there was a lot of controversy. There was a lot of talk about this. Then, when that happened, when the confessor would come and would lay his hands on her, make the sign of the cross, her sisters could move her. She was pliable. They would sit her in her small bed, and so this was something that happened daily. And so for 64 years, she actually lived in this bed. She was not able to walk. She was not able to move. She was basically really kind of nailed in this bed. She was really seriously bedridden. But in all of that time, in the 64 years that she lived in this bed, she never received a bed sore. Um, she never had a problem from lying in bed, and we know that that's always a serious problem with people who are um, bedridden. And and Jesus would come to visit her, and he would give her these sublime truths of the divine will, and he would ask her um, to write them down. And so she would write them down. She didn't really want to because she considered them very private, and she would kind of complain to Jesus sometimes about, "Please don't make me do this. Don't make me write this stuff down. This is private. This is between you and I." But she would write them down, and then she would read them to her confessor. Um, and um, so she did share these things with her confessor. And so this is how became known about these extraordinary events and teachings that she was given. And so all of these things, her inability to eat, her rigid um, body, uh, all of these things, surviving basically only on on the Eucharist. All of these things were examined by many doctors, many priests who couldn't really understand the uh, uh, the logistics of it. Didn't make any sense to them. There was a lot of dogmatic and theological people who came and saw her, spoke to her. They really scrutinized what was happening with her, and there was really very little to no explanation for what was happening. And so she did have, of course, her confessor and Father Franzia, who is actually a canonized saint. and because he was so holy, and she was able to have him as her confessor for a while. She did have a couple of different confessors throughout her life. Um, uh, she would remain in ecstasies for several hours after she would receive Holy Communion, and she would sort of become petrified. Her body became petrified, and she would lose all her sense of touch. She would lose her senses, and so this was extraordinary. And during this time, she would be with the Lord. She would be with Jesus, and Jesus would talk to her. Jesus would, um, her soul would leave her body. She would go places with Jesus. And so these were extraordinary things for these priests and medical doctors and people of the time to hear. But we know that God can do all things. There is nothing that God can't do. And so uh, as time went on, they saw this extraordinary holiness. And as her writings became known, and of course, there were many um, uh, uh, miracles, and extraordinary things that she was learning that was conveyed to her. And so her priest and confessor, who had ordered her actually to write these things down, um, and she was very compliant with that. She was very compliant with her uh, her priest, her confessor, the bishops, all the people that came to see her, the doctors. She was very humble and very quiet, reserved, um, recluse in some ways. She did at one time go to live in the. She did go to live in the convent there in Corrado for some time. She was born. I'll give you here a little sequence of how her life went, and that's what we're going to cover tonight. Really, is just some of these extraordinary facts of Louisa's life. She was born in 1865, and uh, exactly 130 years after her death, that became the first Divine Mercy Sunday. So she was born on the Sunday after Easter in 1865. Um, in 1874, she was 9 years old. She received her first communion and her confirmation. And at that time is when she began to hear Jesus' voice at the very young age of 9. At the age of 13, she received a very extraordinary vision. And we will talk about this vision as we get more into exactly what happened and how these visions and locutions occurred. But this was a very extraordinary vision that she had of Jesus in his passion. And she saw this from the balcony of her room, of her home. And it was very, very real to her, and a very real vision. And so at that age of 13, Jesus had said to her in this vision that she received, this visitation of the Passion, Jesus said to her, "Soul, help me." So Jesus had come to Louisa and asked her for her help in this mission, this very special mission that she had when she was 13 years old. At the age of 16, she became a victim soul. And so at the age of 16, she began to be intermittently confined to bed. She wasn't permanently confined to bed at 16, but she began to have um, illnesses and difficulties. And so she was spending a great deal of time in bed. Again, Louisa was only able to go to school through the first grade. Um, she was poor. Her family were farmers. They left the town during the farming season, and so she didn't like going out of town. She didn't like going to live on the farm. They weren't able to go to mass because the church was very far away, and so she really liked being able to be in the town, receive um, her sacraments, um, and be able to go to mass. There was no mass. There was no church where their farm was. At the age of 17, she composed a Christmas novena, and she would say this novena every year for the rest of her life. And then again, this is another thing that we'll be talking about as we get closer to the holidays, is this Christmas novena that's very, very special to Louisa and celebrating this Christmas season. Um, in 1887, when Louisa was 22 years old, at that point she was definitively confined to bed. At 22, she wasn't having bouts of the ability to get out of bed and function out of bed. At that time, she became permanently confined to her bed. Um, in 1888, when she was 23 years old, a year later, she had an experience of spiritual marriage with Jesus. And we know that this very, very special gift of spiritual marriage comes very, very rarely. There are very few people who have received this gift of spiritual marriage that has come specifically from Jesus. We know that St. Catherine of Siena had this. And so this is what happened with her at 23. And at 24, she had a second nuptial of spiritual marriage with Jesus, and she received the gift of living in the divine will. And at this point, uh, at the age of 24, is when Jesus really took possession of Louisa's heart. And so um, uh, the Trinity began to indwell Louisa's heart. And so she was given this very, very special gift of the divine will. And the only human who had been given this gift of the divine will up to this point had been our Blessed Mother. Um, uh, she had a third nuptial spiritual marriage um, at 33. At this point, she still hadn't written anything. At 33, on obedience to her confessor, Louisa began to write all of these experiences down and the lessons that Jesus had taught her. At 35, um, uh, she became centered and completely possessed by the divine will. At the age of 63, she moved into the convent. Um, some of her books, actually, three of Louisa's works were placed on the index of prohibited books. And this is one of the things that you will hear is, oh, this was placed on the prohibited books. Well, one of the things that I want you to know, and this was in 1938, so were St. Faustina's books placed on the list of prohibited books. Um, um, they were rehabilitated, and just as St. Faustina's writings were um, um, came back to be accepted by the church, so were Louisa Picaretta's. And one of the things that we need to understand about why these books were placed on the prohibited list really had more to do not with the content, but with the interpretation, with the translation of these, because St. Faustina's diaries, of course, were written in Polish, and um, Louisa's books were written in a very specific Italian dialect, and so these had to be removed from the public, and the interpretations and translations were redone, and they went back. Um, so in 1938, she wrote her last volume. In 1947, the only diagnosable illness that Louisa ever experienced was in 1947. She had a very short bout of pneumonia, and she died. Um, on March the 4th in 1947. And in 1994, her cause was opened for um, uh, beatification, and she received the title of Servant of God in 2005. Um, so Louisa's cause for beatification is under review. As we all know, there are lots of things that have to take place during a person's beatification, and so these things are in process. Most of the time, it takes many, many years, but we do know that she has been approved as a servant of God. So um, some of the things that you may have heard or may hear about, is this legitimate? Is this whole thing legit? Can we really believe that these things happened? Well, certainly the church has investigated very closely, very seriously, and have concluded um, um, that she is certainly uh, uh, to be given the title of servant of God, that she is deserving of that title of the church. So I think that can give us all great confidence that the church has looked at all of these events, all of these writings, and found them to be credible and found them to be important to the church. So that will be it for this evening. I know that it's just been a very cursory kind of overview of Louisa and the divine will, but again, there's very, very much, much, much to cover, and it's going to be important for you to get. It's important for us to have a good basis of knowing who it is that we're um, uh, that Jesus is communicating with, and her personality and uh, her limitations and what was going on, because all of these things were um, very pivotal to the role and the thing that she was given. So I want to thank you for joining me this evening, and I hope that this will become a regular um, uh, episode. I will be having another episode on Friday, and Sarah. Some of you may have seen some of mine and Sarah's uh, webcasts together on Mother and Refuge of the End Times, and we have done quite a few of those together. And so Sarah's going to be joining me on Friday morning. We're going to talk a little bit more about Louisa and what this means to live in the divine will, what this means to receive this beautiful gift and to live in this beautiful gift, and how do we do this? And I think this is the biggest question that I get from everyone is, well, how do you do this? And so that's going to be a big, big part of this whole series, this whole conversation that we're going to have about the divine will is, how do we do this? Because it can be very, believe me, the writings can be um, um, sort of, you have to navigate them. You have to really kind of be able to pick them apart and gain an understanding of them. But they're beautiful, beautiful writings, and the teachings of Jesus to Louisa are absolutely beautiful. And again, we have also these visitations that she received from the Blessed Mother. And so the Blessed Mother came to Louisa and sat on her bed for 30 days and taught her every day. And so we have the Book of Heaven um, with the Blessed Virgin Mary, and we'll be talking about this book and reading those messages and those writings that she received from the Blessed Virgin Mary, as well as those from Jesus. So I hope you'll enjoy the series. I hope that you'll join us again. It won't always be me just talking at you like this. I know that this is probably not the most exciting way to engage and have this conversation, but um, we will be talking more about it. And I think as you begin to see some of the examples of some of the things that happened with Louisa and the things that Jesus taught her and told her through these extraordinary revelations, you will see why this is such um, uh, an eventful and extraordinary private revelation that all of us can benefit from. So until next time, God bless you. Fiat. We'll see you next time.